Today we begin exploring one of the most important ideas in modern artificial intelligence, neural networks. Now, if you have heard the term before, it might sound complicated, maybe even a little mysterious. But the core ideas behind neural networks are actually quite intuitive. In fact, at their heart, neural networks are simply systems that learn patterns from data and then use those patterns to make predictions. Throughout this module, we're going to break down how these systems work, step by step. We will start with the smallest building block of a neural network, the artificial neuron. Then we will see how neurons connect together to form layers, and how those layers transform information. And finally, we will explore how neural networks actually learn by gradually correcting their mistakes over time. By the end of this module, you will not only understand what neural networks are, you will also understand how they learn and why they are so powerful in modern AI. So let's begin with the foundations. Before we dive into the details, let's take a moment to look at the bigger picture of what we will explore in this module. Neural networks may seem complex at first, but they are built from a small number of simple ideas. Okay? And once those ideas become clear, everything else in deep learning starts to make much more sense. In this module, we are going to focus on the foundations. First, we will explore what an artificial neuron is and how it processes information. Then we will look at how neurons are organized into layers and how those layers work together to transform inputs into predictions. After that, we will examine some of the key components that control how a neural network behaves. Things like weights, biases, and activation functions. These elements determine how strongly different inputs influence the final output of the network. Next, we will follow the journey of data through a neural network during something called a forward pass, the process the network uses to generate a prediction. And finally, we will look at how neural networks actually learn. You will see how the network measures its own mistakes, how those errors are sent backward through the system, and how the model gradually improves over time. By the end of this module, you should have a clear conceptual understanding of how neural networks function as input-output systems that learn from data. And this understanding will become the foundation for everything we explore later in the course. Now that we have a sense of what this module is about, let's talk about what you should be able to do by the end of it. Think of these learning objectives as a roadmap. They outline the key ideas that will guide our exploration of neural networks. First, you will learn what an artificial neuron is and how it processes inputs in order to produce an output. This is the fundamental building block of every neural network. Next, you will learn how neurons are organized into layers. We will look at the roles of the input layer, the hidden layers, and the output layer, and how information flows through them. Then, we will explore weights and biases, two components that control how strongly different inputs influence the network's predictions. These parameters are what the network adjusts during training. After that, we will compare several common activation functions. These functions are essential because they allow neural networks to model complex and nonlinear relationships in data. We will also examine how a neural network generates predictions through something called a forward pass, which is simply the process of passing information through the network. And finally, we will discuss the learning process itself. You will see how neural networks measure error, how that error is sent backward through the system using backpropagation, and how the model improves using gradient descent. By the time we finish this module, you will have a strong conceptual understanding of how neural networks learn from data and how they make predictions. Let's begin with the most fundamental building block of a neural network, the artificial neuron. You can think of a neuron as a very small decision-making unit. It receives several pieces of information, processes them, and then produces a single output. This idea is loosely inspired by biological neurons in the human brain. In our brains, neurons receive signals from other neurons, combine those signals, and decide whether to pass a signal forward. Artificial neurons work in a very similar way, but in a simplified mathematical form. First, the neuron receives multiple inputs. These inputs could represent anything depending on the problem we are trying to solve. For example, they might represent pixel values in an image, measurements in a medical dataset, or financial indicators in an economic model. Next, the neuron evaluates those inputs and determines how strongly each one should influence the result. And finally, it produces an output that can be passed to other neurons in the network. Individually, a single neuron is actually very simple. But when thousands, even millions of these neurons are connected together in layers, they can learn to recognize incredibly complex patterns in data. And that simple idea, many small units working together, is the foundation of modern deep learning. Now that we understand what a neuron is, let's take a closer look at how it actually processes information. Inside every artificial neuron, 3 key steps happen. The first step is something called a weighted sum. Here's what that means. A neuron receives several inputs, but not all inputs are equally important. Some pieces of information may matter more than others. So the neuron multiplies each input by a number called a weight. You can think of weights as indicators of importance. A larger weight means that input has a stronger influence on the final result. After multiplying each input by its weight, the neuron adds all those values together. This produces a single combined number. The second step is adding something called a bias. The bias acts like a small adjustment knob. It allows the neuron to shift the result slightly, making it easier for the model to represent different patterns in the data. And then comes the third step, the activation function. The activation function decides what the neuron should output based on the value it just computed. Sometimes the neuron will pass the signal forward strongly, sometimes weakly, and sometimes not at all. So in simple terms, a neuron takes inputs, weighs their importance, adjusts the result, and then decides what signal to send forward. And when many neurons perform this process together, layer after layer, the network becomes capable of learning surprisingly complex relationships in data. Now that we understand what a neuron does, let's zoom out and look at the structure of a neural network. A neural network is not just a collection of neurons floating around randomly. Instead, neurons are carefully organized into layers, and these layers form a pipeline for processing information. In most neural networks, we typically see 3 types of layers. First, there is the input layer. This is where the data enters the network. The input layer simply receives the information we want the model to analyze. Next, we have 1 or more hidden layers. These layers perform the real work of the neural network. They transform the input data step by step, extracting patterns and relationships that may not be obvious at first glance. Hidden layers are where the network begins to recognize structure in the data. And finally, we have the output layer. This layer produces the final result, the prediction that the model makes based on everything it has learned. So if you imagine the neural network as a kind of information processing system, the data flows from the input layer through the hidden layers and eventually arrives at the output layer. Each layer transforms the data a little bit more until the network is able to produce a meaningful prediction. Understanding this layered structure is essential because nearly every neural network architecture you will encounter builds on the same basic idea. Let's take a closer look at the input layer. The input layer is the entry point of the neural network, the place where data first entered the system. Every prediction that a neural network makes begins with the information provided here. Now, depending on the problem we are trying to solve, the inputs can represent many different things. For example, if we are building a model that analyzes images, the inputs might be pixel values. If we are predicting housing prices, the inputs might include things like square footage, number of bedrooms, or location. And if we are analyzing financial data, the inputs could be economic indicators, historical prices, or market trends. Each input feature becomes one node in the input layer. But here's an important point to remember. The input layer itself does not perform learning. It does not transform the data, it does not make decisions, and it does not apply activation functions. Its role is simply to receive the data and pass it forward into the network. The real computation, the real pattern recognition begins in the layers that follow. So you can think of the input layer as the doorway to the neural network, the place where raw data enters before the learning process begins. Now we arrive at the part of the neural network where the real intelligence begins to emerge, the hidden layers. Hidden layers sit between the input layer and the output layer, and their job is to transform the data step by step. Each hidden layer receives information from the previous layer, processes that information through its neurons, and then sends the transformed result forward. But what makes hidden layers so powerful is that they allow the network to discover patterns that are not immediately obvious. For example, imagine a neural network that is trying to recognize objects in images. The first hidden layer might detect very simple patterns, things like edges or lines. The next hidden layer might combine those edges to detect shapes, and deeper layers might begin to recognize more complex features, like parts of objects, or even entire objects. So, as information moves deeper into the network, the representations become more abstract and more meaningful. This layered transformation is one of the key reasons neural networks are so effective at modeling complex data. And when a network has many hidden layers, we often refer to it as deep learning, because the network is learning representations at multiple levels of depth. So while a single neuron is simple, when many neurons work together across multiple hidden layers, they can capture incredibly rich structures in data. After information passes through the hidden layers, it eventually arrives at the output layer. The output layer is responsible for producing the final prediction of the neural network. Everything that happened in the earlier layers, all the transformations, all the feature extraction, all the pattern recognition, leads to this final step. Now, the structure of the output layer depends on the type of problem we are trying to solve. For example, if the task is binary classification, such as detecting whether an email is spam or not spam, the output layer may contain just one neuron. That neuron produces a value that represents the probability of one class versus the other. If the task involves multiple categories, such as recognizing different types of animals in images, the output layer might contain several neurons, one for each possible class. And if the task is regression, like predicting a house price, the output layer may produce a single continuous number. So the output layer acts as the network's decision point. It takes everything the network has learned from the data and converts that information into a prediction that we can interpret and use. In other words, the output layer is where the neural network finally answers the question we asked it to solve. Now let's talk about two of the most important components inside a neural network: weights and biases. These two elements are what allow the network to actually learn from data. Remember earlier when we discussed how a neuron receives multiple inputs? Well, each of those inputs is multiplied by a number called a weight. You can think of weights as indicators of importance. If a particular input is very important for making a prediction, the network will assign it a larger weight. If an input is less important, its weight will be smaller. So weights determine how strongly each input influences the neuron's output. But weights alone are not enough. This is where bias comes in. The bias acts like a small adjustment, a way of shifting the neuron's decision threshold. It allows the model to better fit patterns in the data by giving the neuron additional flexibility. Together, weights and biases determine how the neuron responds to its inputs. And here is the key idea. When a neural network is trained, it does not change its structure. The layers stay the same. What changes are the weights and biases. During training, the network gradually adjusts these parameters again and again until the predictions become more accurate. So in many ways, learning in a neural network is really the process of discovering the right combination of weights and biases that best explains the data. Now that we understand what weights are, let's talk about why they matter so much in neural networks. In many ways, weights are the memory of the model. They capture what the neural network has learned from the data. When a neural network begins training, the weights usually start as small random numbers. At that point, the network really doesn't know anything yet. Its predictions are mostly guesses. But as the model sees more data and receives feedback about its errors, those weights begin to change. Some weights become larger, meaning certain inputs are more important. Other weights become smaller, meaning those inputs matter less for the prediction. Over time, this process allows the network to gradually discover which features are most useful for solving the problem. Let's imagine a simple example. Suppose we are building a model to predict housing prices. Features like square footage or location might become very influential, so the model may assign those inputs larger weights. Meanwhile, other features that have less impact might end up with smaller weights. Through this process, the neural network learns how to combine information in a way that improves its predictions. So when we say a neural network has been trained, what we really mean is that it has learned a set of weights that capture patterns in the data. So far, we've seen how neurons combine inputs using weights and biases. But there is another critical component that allows neural networks to become truly powerful: the activation function. An activation function determines what a neuron should output after it processes its inputs. You can think of it as a kind of decision rule. After the neuron calculates its weighted sum, the activation function decides how strongly that signal should be being passed forward to the next layer. Now here's why this matters so much. If we removed activation function entirely, the neural network would behave like a simple linear model. Even if we added many layers, the network would still only be able to represent straight line relationships between inputs and outputs. And that would severely limit what the model could learn. Activation functions solve this problem by introducing nonlinearity. That means the network can model complex patterns, curve relationships, and interactions between variables. This ability to represent nonlinear relationships is one of the key reasons neural networks are so powerful. Without activation functions, deep learning would not really be possible. So while activation functions might look like a small technical detail, they are actually one of the essential ingredients that allow neural networks to learn complex patterns from data. Now that we understand why activation functions are important, let's look at a few of the most commonly used activation functions in neural networks. One of the earliest and most widely known activation functions is the sigmoid function. This sigmoid takes any input value and compresses it into a range between 0 and 1. Because of this property, it is often used when we want the output to represent a probability. For example, predicting the probability that an email is spam. Another activation function you will see very frequently in modern neural networks is ReLU, which stands for Rectified Linear Unit. ReLU works in a very simple way. If the input value is positive, it passes that value forward. If the input value is negative, it outputs 0. Despite its simplicity, ReLU has become the most widely used activation function in deep learning because it is computationally efficient and helps networks train faster. A third activation function you may encounter is TNH, or the hyperbolic tangent function. Unlike sigmoid, which outputs values between 0 and 1, TNH produces outputs between -1 and +1. This can sometimes help the network learn more balanced representations. Each of these activation functions has different properties and different strengths, but they all serve the same essential purpose: enabling neural networks to learn complex and nonlinear relationships in data. At this point, you might be wondering, why are activation functions so important? After all, they are just small mathematical functions inside each neuron, but their impact on what a neural network can learn is enormous. Without activation functions, every layer in the network would simply perform a linear transformation of the data. And here's the surprising part. If you stack multiple linear transformations on top of each other, the result is still just another linear transformation. In other words, no matter how many layers you added, the network would behave exactly like a simple linear model, and that would severely limit its ability to learn complex patterns. Activation functions solve this problem by introducing nonlinearity. This means the network can represent curves instead of just straight lines, complex boundaries instead of simple separations. Because of activation functions, neural networks can recognize images, understand speech, detect fraud, and model highly complex relationships in data. So, while activation functions may seem like a small technical detail, they are actually one of the key ingredients that make deep learning possible. Without them, neural networks would lose most of their power. Now that we understand the components of a neural network, let's look at how the network actually produces a prediction. This process is called the forward pass. The forward pass simply describes how information flows through the network, from the input layer through the hidden layers, and finally to the output layer. Everything moves in one direction, forward. It begins when we provide the model with input data. These inputs enter the network through the input layer and are then passed to the first hidden layer. Each neuron in that layer processes the information using the steps we discussed earlier. It multiplies the inputs by weights, adds a bias, applies an activation function, and produces an output. Those outputs then become the inputs for the next layer, and this process repeats layer after layer, transforming the data a little more at each step. Eventually, the information reaches the output layer. At that point, the network produces its final prediction. So the forward pass is essentially the network's attempt to answer the question we asked it. It takes the inputs we provide, processes them through the network, and generates a prediction based on the current weights and biases. Later, during training, the network will evaluate how accurate that prediction was. But the forward pass is always the first step in that learning process. To make the idea of a forward pass more concrete, let's walk through a simple example. Imagine we are building a neural network that detects spam emails. Every email contains information that can help the model make a decision. For example, the frequency of certain words, the length of the message, the sender's address, or whether the email contains suspicious links. These characteristics become the input features for our neural network. When a new email arrives, those features enter the network through the input layer. From there, the data begins its journey through the hidden layers. Each layer analyzes the information, combining signals, adjusting their importance through weights, and applying activation functions. As the data moves deeper into the network, the system begins to recognize patterns that are associated with spam. Perhaps certain word combinations appear frequently in spam messages, or certain structural patterns show up repeatedly. Finally, the information reaches the output layer. At this point, the network produces a value representing the probability that the email is spam. So, during the forward pass, the neural network takes raw input data, processes it step by step, and ultimately generates a prediction. And that prediction is the model's best guess, based on what it has learned so far. Up to this point, we've seen how a neural network takes inputs and produces a prediction through the forward pass. But an important question still remains. How does the network actually learn? Learning in a neural network happens through a repeating cycle, often called the learning loop. The first step in this loop is the forward pass. The model receives input data and produces a prediction based on its current weights and biases. Next, the model evaluates how accurate that prediction was. It compares the predicted value with the actual correct value. The difference between those two values is called the error, or sometimes the loss. Once the model knows how wrong it was, it needs to figure out how to improve. This is where backpropagation comes in. Backpropagation sends the error signal backward through the network, allowing the model to determine how each weight contributed to the mistake. And finally, the network updates those weights using a method called gradient descent. This step slightly adjusts the weights in a direction that reduces the error. Then the process repeats. Forward pass, measure error, backpropagation, adjust weights, and with each repetition, the network becomes a little bit better at making predictions. Over time, this simple learning loop allows neural networks to discover patterns in data and improve their performance. After the neural network completes a forward pass and produces a prediction, the next step is to determine how accurate that prediction actually was. To do this, the model compares two things. First, the prediction that the neural network produced, and second, the actual correct answer from the training data. The difference between those two values is called the error, or sometimes the loss. You can think of the loss as a way of measuring how far the model's prediction is from the correct answer. If the prediction is very close to the correct value, the loss will be small. If the prediction is far from the correct value, the loss will be much larger. To calculate this error, neural networks use something called a loss function. A loss function is simply a mathematical formula that measures how wrong the prediction is. For example, in regression problems, we often use mean squared error. And in classification problems, a common choice is cross-entropy loss. The important idea here is that the loss function provides a signal for learning. It tells the network how well it is performing and how much improvement is needed. Once the model knows the size of the error, it can begin the process of adjusting its weights to reduce that error in future predictions. Now that the network has measured the error, the next question is, how do we fix it? This is where one of the most important algorithms in deep learning comes into play: backpropagation. Backpropagation is the method that allows the neural network to figure out which parts of the model were responsible for the error. Remember, a neural network may contain hundreds, thousands, or even millions of weights. So when a mistake happens, the model needs a systematic way to determine how each of those weights contributed to that error. Backpropagation solves this problem by sending the error signal backward through the network. Starting from the output layer, the algorithm moves layer by layer in the opposite direction of the forward pass. As it moves backward, it calculates something called a gradient. The gradient tells us how sensitive the loss is to each individual weight. In other words, it tells us how much a particular weight influenced the error. Once those gradients are computed, the model knows exactly which weights need to change and by how much. So backpropagation acts like a diagnostic system for the neural network. It traces the error backward through the model, helping the network understand how to improve its predictions in the future. Once backpropagation has calculated how each weight contributed to the error, the network is ready for the next step, updating those weights. This process is done using a method called gradient descent. Gradient descent is the optimization algorithm that allows the neural network to gradually improve its predictions. Here's the intuition behind it. Imagine you are standing on a foggy mountain, trying to reach the lowest point in the valley. You can't see the entire landscape, but you can feel the slope beneath your feet. So you take a small step in the direction that goes downhill. Then you check again and take another step and another. Step by step, you move closer to the lowest point. Gradient descent works in a very similar way. The gradients calculated during backpropagation tell the model which direction will reduce the error. The algorithm then makes a small adjustment to each weight, moving it slightly in that direction. These updates are usually small, controlled by something called the learning rate. If the steps are too large, the model may overshoot the optimal solution. If the steps are too small, learning may become very slow. But when the process is balanced correctly, gradient descent gradually moves the model toward weights that produce better and better predictions. Now let's bring everything together and look at the complete learning cycle of a neural network. Training a neural network is not a single step. It is a repeating loop that happens many times. Each cycle helps the model improve just a little bit more. The process always begins with the forward pass. The model receives input data and generates a prediction based on its current weights and biases. Next, the model measures how accurate that prediction was. It compares the predicted value with the correct answer and calculates the loss, which represents the error. Once the error is known, the network performs backpropagation. During this step, the error signal is sent backward through the network so the model can determine how each weight contributes to the mistake. And finally, the model applies gradient descent to update those weights. The adjustments are small, but they move the model in a direction that reduces the error. Then the cycle begins again. Forward pass, measure the loss, backpropagation, update the weights. This loop repeats again and again, sometimes thousands or even millions of times during training. And with each iteration, the neural network gradually improves its ability to recognize patterns and make accurate predictions. Before we finish this module, let's step back and reflect on the key ideas we explored. At the most basic level, neural networks are systems designed to learn patterns from data. They are built from small computational units called neurons, which receive inputs, process those inputs, and produce outputs. These neurons are organized into layers. Data enters the network through the input layer, moves through one or more hidden layers where patterns are discovered, and finally reaches the output layer where the model produces its prediction. Inside each neuron, weights and biases determine how strongly different inputs influence the result. These parameters are what the neural network adjusts during training. We also saw that activation functions play a crucial role. They introduce nonlinearity into the network, allowing it to model complex relationships that simple linear models cannot capture. Then we followed the path of information through the network during a forward pass, where the model transforms inputs into predictions. And finally, we explored how neural networks actually learn through a repeating cycle of error measurement, backpropagation, and gradient descent. The model gradually improves its predictions over time. Understanding these core ideas gives you the conceptual foundation needed to study more advanced neural network architectures. Because no matter how sophisticated a deep learning model becomes, it is always built on these same fundamental principles.